Today we'll be talking about 4 different topics. First of all, we'll be talking very briefly about who are gifted students. Why should we identify them? How does it benefit them? We'll be talking about a report issued by the National Association for Gifted Children called State of the States that describes the types of policies, who is served, and more in the country. And finally, we'll be talking about the golden rule of identification, and that is how identification should align up with programs and services. We'll be coming back to that periodically throughout the course. First of all, let's take a little gifted ed quiz to warm up. See how many of these you can get right. Is it true or false that gifted students don't need help? Everybody thinks, well, they're doing okay. They're getting straight A's, right? Well, actually, that's false. Not all gifted students get straight A's. Some of them do need help, not only academic help, but sometimes social and emotional help. How about this one? Gifted students are fine in the regular classroom. Is that true or false? Well, that's a tricky one because it's both true and false. Some gifted students are fine in the regular classroom, especially in classrooms where the work is differentiated and they're being challenged. Others are languishing or miserable in regular classrooms. How about this one? Gifted students learn the best by teaching other students. This is something we hear a lot, and it's understandable because busy classroom teachers are trying to bring up their lower students, so they solicit help from gifted students as sort of little teacher aides or peer advisors. Is that true or false? Do they learn the best? Actually, it's false. While they might enjoy teaching other students, they're not advancing their own skills. And so we talk about how this practice should be minimized. Not that it should never be used, but minimized. All children are gifted. You might have heard this. Actually, that is false. When we talk in this course about gifted children, we'll be talking about very specific definitions as determined by usually the local school district. Acceleration options are socially harmful. So the acceleration options are things like skipping grades or grade acceleration in one content area. For example, if a student is very good at math, they might go to the next grade level for a math lesson. Is that harmful? Usually not. There are cases where it's not to be advised, and we'll be touching on these later in the course. Usually they are socially and academically helpful. Gifted programs are elitist. You might have heard this. This is true and this is false. It depends on how it's done. We do know at times it's been used as an exclusionary barrier to underrepresented students, for example, Hispanic students. But if done appropriately, we can identify all students in various racial and ethnic groups in various socioeconomic status, and it doesn't have to be elitist. Students with poor grades are sometimes gifted. Is that true or false? That is true, and that might surprise you. It's not only the A students who we might consider gifted. These students might be underperforming for a reason. All gifted students are happy. Of course, you probably got false on that. Not all students are happy, gifted or not. Students in special education are sometimes gifted. Is that true or false? That is true. And actually, students who are in gifted education and who are gifted and in special education might be considered dual exceptional. Students with poor handwriting and or organizational skills can be gifted. This is true. So let's begin. Who are gifted students? Well, we have all known students that we kind of think are gifted, but we're not really sure why. There is a federal gift definition of giftedness. The federal Education, Elementary and Secondary Education Act defines gifted and talented students as, and this is a quote, students, children, or youth who give evidence of high achievement capability in areas such as intellectual, creative, artistic, or leadership capacity, or in specific academic fields and who need services and activities not ordinarily provided by the school in order to fully develop those abilities. This is provided in Part A of Title IX. Many states and districts follow this definition, but the bad news is it has no teeth to it. States are not required to follow this definition. This definition is a guideline. Some states don't follow it at all. But I do want to call your attention to several important words in this definition. The first is evidence of high achievement capability. So that means that they have to be giving some type of achievement evidence. So it could be high grades for some districts, it could be IQ scores for another district. But look within that and look at the areas: intellectual, creative, artistic, leadership. Those are very different areas, right? Or specific academic fields. So you might have one district identifying students who are academically gifted in math. Another might identify reading. Another might say, no, we want our program only to focus on artistically gifted students or students who demonstrate leadership ability. Another district might say we want only the intellectually superior students. Many districts do a combination of these. So there is no one definition, one size fits all for all the programs in the country or even within a state. Not only that, but we know from years and years of research that gifted students have certain traits and attributes that are not reflected in this federal definition or indirectly reflected. We know, for example, that gifted students often show intense or unusual interests. They might, for example, become quite interested in dinosaurs for several weeks or months, and then it passes. They learn everything they can about dinosaurs. Maybe your gifted students are the ones that laugh at a joke in the classroom because they have an advanced sense of humor. Maybe they have deep insight and can make connections that other students might miss. They might show a great deal of imagination or creativity. They might be the ones that talk about writing imaginative stories, and you go, where did you come up with that? They might be very logical and able to reason through a problem, for example, a math problem or a science issue. They might know a lot of information. They have a great storehouse in their memory. I used to have, for example, a student that would come up to me and say, I know, I've read the encyclopedia and I know the articles in it. When I questioned him, he was right. They might be motivated, although they might not be. They might have great communication skills. They might often like to hang out with adults. You might have noticed this rather than children, because they relate better to adults. They might be able to make sense of inquiry processes better. So you might see this show up in science, for example, where they're the first students to grasp how to design a science investigation. And they might have enhanced problem-solving ability. So all of these traits have been researched and documented and are not specifically reflected in that definition, or maybe they're only reflected indirectly. So why should we even bother to identify? I like to call out this quote from John F. Kennedy. Not every child has an equal talent or an equal ability or equal motivation, but children have the equal right to develop their talent, their ability, and their motivation. And I think this quote applies to all, the entire spectrum of our students. take the students' abilities wherever they are and develop them further. So one of the things that we know is that many students, many gifted students, and this was actually from research at the University of Connecticut, many gifted students come into or start the school year in September knowing 50% or more of the content they're going to be taught. So that means they're sitting in classrooms and basically daydreaming or bored or reading, while the lesson is going on because they know the material. Why not take that that student and challenge him or her to the next level appropriately? There's also something called the Gifted Students Bill of Rights, and this is from a prominent researcher, again at the University of Connecticut, Del Sigley. You have a right to learn something new every day. So think about this. If you were going into school and you weren't learning anything new any day, you'd get pretty bored pretty quickly. And as a matter of fact, we see in areas that have few or no gifted services, we see these children at risk for dropping out at a greater rate than if they're being challenged appropriately. So let's talk for a minute about the state of the states in gifted education. There's a report that was put out in 2014 and 15, that's the last time it was updated, that basically surveyed districts throughout states in the nation to find out what they were doing for gifted education. And we're going to go through some of the highlights here. Only 40 out of the 50 states responded, I should say. So everything we're going to get, we don't really know fully what's going on in the other 10 states. I would venture to argue that little or nothing is going on in the 10 states that didn't respond. So whatever we talk about here, if it looks gloomy, it's actually probably gloomier. Of the 40 states responding, they asked, do you identify and serve gifted students? So that's two different questions. Identification, which is what we're going to be mostly studying in this course, is how do you find those students and tag them with a gifted label. Serving means, do you offer services? Do they go out during the day and receive gifted programming services? Is there a push-in teacher? Is there differentiated curriculum? So identification and services or programs are different. Of the 40 states responding, 32 had some type of mandate related to gifted and talented education. So this means there was some policy that spoke about gifted and talented education. 28 of those 32 required both identification and services, while 4 states required identification only. So think about this. 10 states aren't responding, and then of the 32, of the 40 states that responded, 8 states didn't have any mandate at all because 40 minus 32. And then of those, 28 had mandates for both identification and services. So the message this gives us is that it's very spotty. A lot of states are doing nothing. Some states are doing only identification. So they say, I identify you as gifted, good luck to you. And then there are states, 28, who require both identification and services. That might surprise you, especially if you come from a special ed background where this is much more formalized and mandated and has been since the 1960s. Where does the funding for gifted programs come from? So again, 32 states reported some type of mandate for funding, but only 4 of those had full funding. 20 had partial funding, and 8 was mandated but no funding. Well, we know that if something is not funded, it's not likely to happen. Who determines who is gifted in the states? Is it determined at the local level? Is it determined at the state level? At the federal level? So what they found was that of 39 states reporting, 21 reported that it was determined by their local educational association, or the LEA. So this was 21. 12 said it was determined at the state level, and 8 said other. We don't know what that means, but 7 said no, that neither one of those was who determined it. What criteria are used? So we know that gifted students vary wildly in what they're gifted in. What are we going to use to identify gifted students? Well, there were 33 responses in the states. Multiple criteria, 19 of them said we use multiple criteria. What that means is they use more than one thing. So it could be an IQ test, it could be grades and an IQ test. Multiple criteria is good, by the way. Achievement data usually means things like uh, state types of testing or report cards. IQ scores would be when a student is given a full-blown IQ assessment. We'll talk about that later in the course. Nominations and referrals. This usually means a teacher has noticed that a student might be gifted, and so nominates that student, refers that student for assessment. And you can look down here so you can see it varies wildly how students are or what criteria are used to determine whether students are gifted. If you move to another state, if you're deemed gifted in one state, you move to another state, is that recognized? Well, not always. So out of 38 states reporting, only 5 said that their state policy specifically permits that. That if they get a student from another state that's been identified as gifted, they can still be identified as gifted. 5 said no, the state policy does not permit that, so that student would have to be reassessed. 20 said there was no state policy, they just leave it up to the districts to decide. And 8 said, yes, there is a state policy that specifically states that it's left up to the districts to decide. So again, you could be gifted in one state, and if you have the misfortune of moving to another state, you lose that status. When are students identified? So out of the 27 responding, 19 said following a teacher referral or a parent referral. 17 said at multiple points at K to 12. 13 said following a student referral. So this may surprise you that in some districts, students are allowed to self-nominate. 10 said when students transfer from out of state. And these are not exclusionary, so states checked off as many as applied. But the most common time to identify is following a teacher referral. One of the things that we'll be talking about throughout the course is called the golden rule of identification. And that even though there's little consistency across the state, across districts within the states, there needs to be consistency in the process. And what that means is your district needs to come up with a definition of what it means to be gifted. And that leads into identifying for those traits, identifying students for those traits, and that leads into programming for gifted and talented students. So let's take an example. Suppose your definition of district suppose your definition of giftedness in your district is we're going to identify all mathematically talented students, and we want to serve those. So that's our definition. It doesn't mean you don't believe other forms of giftedness don't exist. It just means that in our district, we're going to focus on mathematically talented students. So you come up with a definition of who is a mathematically talented student. Then you identify for mathematically talented students. So, for example, if all students take a basic skills assessment in second grade, you might scan those scores and look for very high scores in math. Then you might follow that up with an Iowa test of basic skills, for example, which is an achievement test in math. You don't say that you're going to call that your definition is going to be mathematically talented students and then use an instrument or an assessment that assesses reading. That would be a mismatch. Once you've identified your students, then you have to provide programming and services for those students, in this case, mathematically talented students. So you wouldn't identify mathematically talented students and then provide enrichment in reading. That would be a mismatch. It's okay to want to identify different areas. So maybe your definition is math and reading and science and social studies. And you have instruments that identify all of those and services that identify all of those. It's okay, although limiting, to say we're only going to identify or define giftedness as IQ giftedness, and then identify those with an IQ test and provide programming and services for those high IQ students that match their high IQ. Now, one caveat is obviously districts don't have limitless resources. So when you're planning this golden rule, you have to take into account, well, what do we have the money to be able to provide? And that kind of backs up, and it might influence who your program serves and what your definition of giftedness is. So the definition and sort of corollary to that, the mission statement for your program drives identification, and that drives programming. The golden rule of identification. So let's review some key ideas. No one can agree on who gifted students are. We sort of know them by their traits when they see them. Although there is a federal definition, it doesn't have teeth. It's important to identify gifted students so they will be taught at an instructional level appropriate to them. Some states do not identify or serve gifted students, while others identify but do not serve, and some do both. Although there is a federal definition of giftedness, states are inconsistent about who is gifted, how they identify and serve those students. And finally, the golden rule, identification and assessment should match programs and services. Thank you.